to share
Uh,
it?
You'll be sharing your screen in just a moment.
Oh,
But
okay.
we'll just take a moment we'll do that in just a moment. We'll go ahead and let everybody in. I have a slide to share in just a moment as well,
Okay.
and then I'll give it over to you. So shouldn't be a problem. All right. Donna, Hans, James, good to see everybody coming in from all over. I'm curious if anybody wants to put out there, if this is not your first time at a Greenlight Guru event, I'd love to see what your favorite event has been as we wait for the program or the platform to let everybody trickle in. It's always interesting to see what people have enjoyed seeing in the past. Maybe we can resurrect some new topics, but
Well,
resurrect
I'm
new
sure,
topics.
Eddie, and whatever they say their favorite event was in the past, that's
Yeah.
going to change after today, because obviously today's webinar is going to be their favorite event.
That's right. That's right. That should be the goal every time. I think so. Okay. Well, Jetty, this is your second one. It should be difficult because your first one should be your favorite. But yes, absolutely, I'm with you. Okay. Janet can't hear Michael. Is anybody else having issues hearing Mike? Let's go ahead and do a. Okay. All right. Well, we're about a minute over, so let's go ahead. Mike, why don't you just say something real quick? It seems like some people can't hear you, but I think.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Somebody give me a
Testing, 1, 2,
positive.
3.
Okay. All right. Looks like we have enough. So play with your settings. Hopefully we can figure that out. But looks like enough people can, so maybe it's not on our end. But looks like it's about time to begin. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar, Corrective Action Preventive Action versus Preventive Action Corrective Action, or CAPA versus PACA. Which one is the smarter approach? My name is Etienne Nichols. I'll be the moderator for today's session. A few housekeeping items before we dive into our presentation. First, we invite you to actively participate. It already looks like we have a great audience for this today. The chat section on the top right, you'll see two tabs, chat and Q&A. What we typically prefer is the chat tab to connect with people in the audience and to just kind of voice your opinions as you have them if you like, but always remember to play nice. The Q&A section on the top right, that's where you can ask questions, where we will present those to Mike at the end during the Q&A section for the actual formal session. So even if you don't have a question that you feel you want to ask directly, go ahead and check out that Q&A section, because you can upvote those questions that are most relevant to you by using the thumbs up. And that way we can make sure we're asking the most relevant questions at the end. Second, we will be sending out the full recording and the presentation slides to all registrants after the live event. So keep an eye out for your inbox for that follow-up email. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life through our work in the medical device industry, likely a shared goal of many of you here today. We host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. Our software is designed to help medical device companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our software suite includes solutions for product development, quality management, clinical data management, all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. You can join over 1,000 leading medical device companies that trust Greenlight Guru by visiting www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo after today's webinar. Now to introduce today's presenter, Mike Drews. Mike Drews, PhD, is the president of Vascular Sciences, a consulting and training company offering a broad range of services to medical devices, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, including creative regulatory strategy and competitive regulatory intelligence, regulatory submission design, FDA presentation preparation, and defense. Mike is an internationally recognized expert who brings a breadth of knowledge and hands-on experience with his teachings from the ongoing work he does for FDA, Health Canada, and other regulatory and governmental agencies around the world. He's also a featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technologies and regulatory affairs. And if you're familiar with the Global Medical Device podcast that we host at Greenlight Guru, you'll recognize his voice right away, as he's a longtime frequent guest on the show. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Mike. Are you able to share your screen at this point?
Can you just remind me how to do that, Eddie?
Yeah, there should be a, let's see here. There should be a button on the, I'm struggling to find it myself. Have they hidden it from us? They've changed it a little bit.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. Sure. Okay, I think you're seeing it now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay,
You go
perfect.
into presentation mode, we should be good to go. Okay.
Okay, and I'll hide this. All right, so just to confirm, so you're able to see my
Yep.
PowerPoint screen.
I can
Okay,
see your
terrific.
PowerPoint.
All right, thank you, Etienne. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar on corrective action, preventative action versus preventative action, corrective action, which is the smarter approach. My name is Dr. Michael Drews. I'm going to be conducting today's webinar. Just a couple of real quick things before we begin. First of all, I want to thank my many friends at Greenlight Guru for the opportunity to have this webinar with you today. I also want to thank all of you in the audience, both those of you that are here with us live right now and those of you that are be watching this recording in the future, because without all of you, we would just be wasting our time. Etienne did a very nice introduction of myself, so I don't want to reiterate too much of that, but there is a little bit that I want to emphasize. First of all, in addition to working as a regulatory and quality consultant for a wide variety of medical device companies, I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as Health Canada and a few of the other regulatory bodies around the world. And the reason why I say that, quite frankly, is because there's not a lot of people that can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And I really try to use that to my advantage. In addition to that, as Etienne said, not only do I do webinars and podcasts for Greenlight, but for some other organizations as well. And you have on the screen what some of them are. In the handout that you will be getting after the webinar, it will include hyperlinks to these, so you don't have to worry about writing them down. And just a tiny little bit more about myself. Last year, I was named one of the 24 MedTech voices to follow in 2024. Interestingly enough, they haven't updated the list to 2025, at least not that I know of. If somebody has seen that list, please share it with me, but I have not seen it. And further, in terms of Greenlight, I've had some very successful podcasts and webinars. Here are some of the top ones that I've done with Greenlight. So not trying to be arrogant, just simply very proud of what I've been able to accomplish, and the fact that I have now somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 people per month on average, either watching or listening to my stuff. Even many of my friends at the FDA, although I'm sure they would never admit to that publicly. So before we get into the content, I just want to see where we are kind of as an audience. So Etienne, if we could pull up the polling questions. The first one is, have you used a CAPA before? Yes or no? Have you used a CAPA before? And we'll just wait a few seconds for people to respond to that.
And okay, and if you are not able to see that, that should be in the top between the chat and the Q&A tab. So look at that poll section and you can go ahead and vote. Looks like we have getting a few votes in.
And Etienne, I can't see the polling on my screen, but if you can just kind of tell me when we get a representative sample, then we'll move to the next one.
Yeah, it looks like the platform's kind of glitching a little bit. It's not letting me see the yeses, but we're getting at least 17 no's.
That's, oh, I am so tempted to make a political reference here, but I'm not. We can only see the no's, not the yeses.
Yeah, this
wow,
is not digital on my part, but yes.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one then. If you have been involved with a CAPA, did it work and actually correct and ultimately prevent the problem? Yes or no? And then my sort of rhetorical question after that is, how do you know? So if you've done a CAPA or been involved with a CAPA, did it work and actually correct or prevent a problem?
All right, looks like about half are no so far.
Really? That says something about the CAPA process. I'm not surprised, as we'll talk about, but I'm not surprised. All right, and then I think, Etienne, for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the third one. Do you have any CAPAs that, for whatever reasons, have not been closed or resolved? And then my rhetorical follow-up is, how do you know? But the yes/no question is, do you have any CAPAs that have not been closed or not been resolved for whatever reason?
Looks like about 3/4 are yes.
Wow. Okay. That's a little surprising, even for me. But thank you everybody who participated. And like I said, tempted as I am to make a political a comment, I won't if we're only seeing, no's and not yeses. But all right, let's continue on. So here's what I'm hoping to cover in the short time that we have together today. First of all, what are some of the most common reasons why FDA issues 483 observational letters and as well as warning letters? And then specifically, what are the common reasons involving CAPAs? What is a CAPA and when should it be used or alternatively not used? How do you know if your CAPA system is working? I think this is something that a lot of people assume, that if they have their CAPA that is compliant to the QSR regulation or their quality management system in general, if they tick all of the required boxes, then their system must be working. Well, in fact, I never make such an assumption. As a matter of fact, I see many examples of quality management systems that do tick all of the required boxes that are clearly not working. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. How are CAPAs related to other parts of your quality management system? For example, risk, post-market surveillance, complaint handling, and so on. When should a complaint initiate a CAPA? And for that matter, when should a change in risk initiate a CAPA, or your post-market surveillance initiate a CAPA? Everything is related. And finally, we get to my favorite question, which is actually the subtitle of this webinar. Why do we call a CAPA a CAPA? Isn't that, quite frankly, isn't that back-ass words? Because that puts all of the emphasis on correcting the problem once it happened and then preventing it. Should it not be a better approach to prevent the problem from happening to begin with? So perhaps our whole system is, at least the CAPA portion of the system, is back-ass words. And again, I don't mean to offend anybody by using that term, but I'm just using that term for emphasis. And then depending on time, I have several other bonus questions and tips and tricks that we can throw in, time permitting, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts and send you on your way. So we've got a lot of information to cover, and we're going to go pretty quick. So please put your seatbelt on, and hopefully you'll enjoy the ride. So why am I devoting an entire webinar to the topic of CAPAs? Well, first of all, CAPAs can be your best friend from a regulatory or a quality perspective, but as we're going to talk a little bit towards the tail end of this webinar, CAPAs can also be your worst nightmare from a product liability perspective, because as an expert witness, and as some of you know, I spend a lot of my time working as an expert witness in medical device product liability cases. CAPAs are one of the first things that I will typically ask to look at during discovery. So we have to be really careful how we write them, not just from an FDA perspective, but from a product liability perspective. But back to the original question, why am I devoting an entire webinar to this topic? After all, don't we have lots of resources on CAPAs already? For example, we have the quality system regulation, we have guidance, we have webinars, not just mine, but a litany of other people have done webinars and podcasts on CAPAs. Of course, mine are better. FDA has done webinars on CAPAs. There are numerous articles on CAPAs and so on and so on. And yet, do we use CAPAs effectively? Do we use CAPAs effectively? As a matter of fact, in just the polling questions that we started out with, it seems to indicate that many of you are using CAPAs, but maybe you're not using them effectively. If you've got a lot of CAPAs, for example, that have not been closed or resolved, are you using them effectively? But let's begin with taking a look at some statistics. What are the most common reasons why FDA issues 483 observations and warning letters? Would you be surprised to learn that CAPAs are actually one of them? They're one of the top 3, and in some years they're actually the number 1. And not only that, but CAPAs have been one of the top 3 for a very long time. In fact, for at least 16 of the last 17 years. So regrettably, we have been making the same mistakes over and over again for nearly 2 decades now, in spite of the fact that we have all of these resources on CAPAs and so on and so on. So I want to share with you the top 10 reasons for 483 observations. For those of you that remember David Letterman, and I know I'm dating myself here because I suspect some of you watching this webinar probably not even were born when he had his TV show, but he had his famous or infamous top 10 list. So the top 3 are CAPAs, design controls, and complaints. CAPAs, which is the topic of this webinar, a little over 12%, almost 12.5% of all 483 observations are because of CAPAs, followed closely by design controls and complaints. Collectively, CAPAs, design controls, and complaints represent a little over a third, about 35% of all clauses cited in 483s as of a couple of years ago, and that statistic, regrettably, has not changed much. Just to round out the list, the other top 10 are purchasing controls, process validation, medical device reporting or MDRs, non-conforming product, production and process controls, acceptance activities, and quality audits. These are the top 10, but obviously in this webinar, we're focusing on CAPA. What's the message here? That top 10 that I'm showing you on the screen right now, that accounts for 75% or 3/4 of all of the 483 observations that FDA issues. That's not something particularly we should be proud of as an industry, I think. And again, keep in mind these statistics that I'm sharing with you are for our industry across the board. I'm not making any implications or judgments on specific companies. This is just sort of, across the board. So as I said, 1/3 of all device 483 citations, design controls, CAPAs, and complaints. The CAPAs over the last almost 25 years is shown by the red line here. Although there is some fluctuation, it basically oscillates between about 10 and 14%. 10 and 14%. So a significant number of CAPAs generate problems for companies with the FDA, and this trend has continued for a long time. This is perhaps one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to do this webinar today, because in spite of the fact that there are tons of resources out there for CAPAs, how do we explain these statistics? Call me naive, and certainly some people do, but I'm trying to make the world a better place. And it's just frustrating to me, as I've been doing this now for a little over 30 years. I see people making the same mistakes over and over and expecting a different result. As you know, that's Einstein's definition of insanity. So is this a new trend? Well, what constitutes a trend? As I said, 1/3 of all device-related 483s are these top 3, and CAPAs is one of them. So it's absolutely not a new trend. And I hope everybody notes the irony, maybe even the hypocrisy, because in complaint handling, for example, we are required, it's in the quality system regulation, to do trend analysis. And yet when it comes to things like CAPAs, we're not required. And in fact, in my experience, most companies do not do trend analysis. I just think that's ironic, maybe even Hippocratic. And oftentimes I see this in my practice where a company might institute a CAPA, but it turns out that it's addressing a symptom and not the underlying cause or the root cause. And every once in a while, I recommend this to companies, every once in a while, you should take a look at all of your captives, not individually, but all of them collectively, to see if there are similarities in different CAPAs that maybe you have not seen before. Because there usually is a relationship. If you just simply address the symptom of a problem, obviously you have not address what an engineer would call the root cause, and therefore it stands to reason that you're going to continue to have the same or similar problems, and maybe the same or similar CAPAs and complaints as you do now. And again, when I show you statistics, you're going to see that big time. So many of you are familiar with Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. This is sort of a spin on Einstein's definition, which I think is particularly applicable here. The definition of insanity is repeating the same mistakes over and over again and expecting a different result. Regrettably, and I don't take any pride about saying this about my industry, but regrettably, we seem to be very, very good at making the same mistakes over and over again. You know, a lot of people think that practice makes perfect. However, it is simply not the case. Practice does not make practice does not make perfect. perfect practice makes perfect. If you practice over and over and make the same mistakes over and over, you're going to get very, very good at making those mistakes, right? So again, please don't misunderstand here. I don't take pride in saying this, but if we want to call ourselves medical device professionals, and I take that word professional very, very seriously, then we have a professional responsibility. We have an ethical responsibility, perhaps, to take have an honest discussion about not just what we do well, but maybe what we don't do well and how we can do better. So back to the original question of what constitutes a trend. Here we have some data. Well, with the benefit of hindsight, in other words, seeing the big picture, so to speak, we can see that the overall trend of this data is upward. It's on a positive slope. However, we never have all of the data that we would like to have. For example, any monkey can see a trend after we have 15 or 20 or more data points, which is what we have here. But what if we only have a smaller number of data points? What if we have, sorry, what's happening here? What if we only have a few data points, 3 data points, or 2 data points, or 1 data point? Is it possible to see a trend with 1 data point? Or indeed, what if we have no data points at all? Is it possible to see a trend with 0 data points? Many people would say no. However, I would say absolutely yes. In fact, seeing a trend before you have any data is an incredibly valuable skill to have that, quite frankly, most people do not. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. Let me say that one more time. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. So remember, all of us, myself included, we take the limits of our own field of vision as the limits of the world. And we quite frankly should not do that. I can't tell you how many times I see people walking into the FDA, for example, and they'll try to make the argument that we don't have evidence of something happening, therefore it doesn't happen. Well, the late, great Carl Sagan said, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In other words, I was not in China this morning to see it, but I'm pretty sure that the sun came up in China. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. I don't have direct evidence. I don't have data to support it, but I'm pretty sure that it happened. Just, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And can we ever see the whole picture? In spite of how much data that we have, can we ever see the whole picture? I would say no. Let's take this a little bit careful. If an alien landed on Earth, let's take this a little further, rather. If an alien landed on Earth on a rainy day, what would he or she or it likely conclude? Well, they would probably conclude that it always rains on Earth. And that would be a reasonable conclusion. But obviously, that's not the case. How do we know that? Because we live on Earth every day, and we can travel to the other parts of Earth. And we know that although it does rain occasionally in different places, it certainly doesn't rain everywhere all the time. And so we live here, we have more experience, i.e., we have more data. But the alien landing today, they only have that 1 data point. So what's the lesson to be learned here? Again, no matter how much data that we have, and this doesn't apply just to CAPAs, but to everything, we always have limited data. We never have as much data as we would like to have. And more importantly, we also need to apply a little common sense in order to see a trend. Let's continue on. I think I shared this quote with you before. One of my favorite ones: discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. So let me just flip back to this previous slide for just a moment. Sorry, not that one. This one. Anybody looking at this picture, they can see a trend. But for some reason, you have a portion of the slide that's missing. What if we only had this amount of data right here that I'm circling with my mouse? I hope you can see that. Then your conclusion would be the opposite. It would be a negative trend, and it would be a pretty steep negative trend. On the other hand, if we only had this amount of data right here, we would get the opposite conclusion. It would be a very steep positive trend. So no matter how much data that we have, it is never enough. And this is the whole reason why it's not the topic of today's webinar, but this is the whole reason why post-market surveillance is so important, because no matter how much testing that we do on our medical device prior to putting it onto the market, it is never enough. Never, ever, ever. You can test your device from now until the sun burns out. It will still be never enough for the reasons that we're talking about here. All right, continuing on. So let's dig in a little more. As I said, the focus of this webinar is CAPA, but I just threw, for the sake of completion, some common reasons on the design control side. For example, not demonstrating that a device conforms to defined user needs or intended uses. That's the most frequent reason under the design controls section. I mean, duh, did you go to engineering school at all? I mean, this is so basic, and yet this is one of the most common reasons. And another most common reason is risk management. As some of you who have listened to my other podcasts know, I'm a subject matter expert for FDA in many different areas, one of them being risk. And it amazes me how many companies get dinged because, look at the first one, not performing a risk analysis. It's one thing to quibble about, okay, the company did a risk analysis, but maybe it wasn't complete or it was inadequate or something. Okay, that is subject to interpretation. But for them not to perform a risk analysis in general, I mean, you don't have to have a JD after your name from Harvard or Hopkins or wherever to appreciate that from a product liability perspective. If I can show it, you and your company get sued, and I can show as an expert witness that you did not do a risk analysis on your device, can you say ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching? Here are some of the other reasons under the validation topic that companies get concerned. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into those because we want to get to the CAPA, but I'll leave this as a rhetorical question. And if anybody wants to try to address it in the Q&A at the end of the webinar, I would be happy to. How can we explain such boneheaded mistakes? And again, some people might take offense to that phrase boneheaded, but believe me, I am being extremely polite here. I can think of much, much more better, more accurate words or phrases to use than boneheaded. Maybe I'm being overly naive or overly harsh. I don't know. Some of you might think that I am in this very hypersensitive, politically correct society that we seem to live in today. But I don't, I'm getting old. I don't have the patience for all that PC stuff. These are just boneheaded mistakes. Continuing on the complaint side, very quickly. And I did a webinar for Greenlight on complaint handling I think last year. I don't remember exactly when, but if you are interested, send me an email. I'll be happy to give you access to that webinar. I also do a 3-day course on post-market surveillance and complaint handling for industry, for people in company like you all. So if you're interested, send me an email. I'll be happy to send you the info on that. But look at the most common reason why complaints, companies get dinged up with complaints. They didn't document the procedures. They didn't maintain their complaint files. Complaints of device failures were not investigated. That is inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. Once again, we could easily quibble over the level of the investigation that the company did. Maybe it wasn't sufficient, maybe it wasn't involved enough, something like that. But for them to get a complaint and not to investigate it at all, that is just inexcusable. And I will also say, and this is where I differ with my FDA friends, the QSR under complaints seems to they don't directly say this, but they seem to sort of imply that all complaints should be investigated equally. And I am adamantly against that. Coming from a medical background, I use a lot of medical metaphors. So imagine going to the emergency room. They use the triage approach. So theoretically, a patient having a heart attack will be seen before a patient who has a splinter in their figure, right? We should do the same thing here. Certain complaints need more investigation. Other complaints need very little investigation. That is up to our professional judgment to determine. That is not specified in the regulation. And quite frankly, it shouldn't be specified in the regulation. That should be up to us. The complaints were not reviewed or evaluated to see if an investigation was necessary or lacked a rationale for not conducting an investigation. If you have a complaint that for whatever reason you deem you don't need to investigate it, fine, no problem. But at the very least, you need to document, and I'm not talking about a 300-page PhD dissertation. You have to document, maybe with just a sentence or two. We received this complaint on such and such a day. It is not necessary to investigate, and here are all the reasons why. Quite frankly, there's an irony here. It's taking me longer. It's taking me more time to explain to you what to do than what it would take to actually sit down and bang out those 1 or 2 or 3 sentences. And yet this is another very, very common reason why companies get dinged on the complaint side. Complaints were not deemed that were deemed reportable were not properly investigated. Records didn't contain required information, and these are just the ones that we know about. Once again, how do we explain? How do we analyze? How do we justify any of these? Is it even possible to justify these? And by the way, sorry, this is just. Oh, sorry, I'll skip that. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Okay, finally, let's get into the focus of reasons why companies get 483s and warning letters, specifically because of CAPAs, the subject of today's webinar. And I hope that you will see a trend here, pun definitely intended. So most common CAPA-related 483s, these are real, not hypothetical examples. As we'll talk about, a CAPA is a process of making corrective actions and so on. We'll come back to that in a moment. The 2 most common reasons why companies get pinged by the FDA, specifically because of CAPAs. Manufacturers did not document their procedures. Again, I had a friend who used to do GMP training, and he was fond of the adage in GMP: if it was not documented, it didn't happen. If it was not documented, it didn't happen. And so not only do you need to document your procedures, you need to document the fact that you're following your procedures. Because if you have a documented procedure, but you don't follow it, then what's the point? You're just, you're just wasting time and money having a procedure that you're not following. One of the most common reasons why. The other most common reasons why is that the manufacturers, including perhaps some of you all in this audience, I hate to say it, did not adequately capture CAPA activities. Adequately capture CAPA activities. Now, again, as we're going to talk about in more detail later, we can quibble about what adequately capture means. What you think is adequate might not be what FDA thinks is adequate. So the first example there, they did not document their procedures. That's sort of a binary, yes or no, either they did or they didn't. However, the second one, that is analog. In other words, not adequately. That's not just yes or no. There's an infinite number of areas of gray, kind of like a potentiometer. You can turn it up and down as opposed to a digital switch, like your light switch on the wall. Okay, so did not adequately capture CAPA activities. Once again, and I'll leave this as a rhetorical question, but we are going to see specific examples as we continue. And if anybody wants to chime in during the Q&A at the end, I would welcome, your input. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't agree with me. And I love it when people don't agree with me, by the way. How do we explain this? How do we rationalize it? How do we justify it? And so on. And once again, these are the things that we know about. What about the things that we don't know about? Let me see if this one works. Okay, this one works. Okay, so have you ever seen an iceberg? This is what most people see, but is this the whole problem? Often what you don't see or what you don't know is more dangerous than what you see or what you know. If we look below the surface, this is the bigger picture. This is real. This came from a rig manager in Newfoundland. They have to divert the path of these things away from the rig by towing them with ships. In this case, the water was calm and the sun was directly overhead. So the diver was able to take this picture, clear water, They estimate the weight of this thing to be 300 million tons. And now we know why they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And we also know why the Titanic sank. So again, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but I think this is an important point. We can never see the big picture. We can try to see as much as we can, but we can never see everything. All right, continuing on. We talked about that already. Okay, so what's the root cause of not just CAPA problems, but complaints and recalls and warning letters? Well, as an engineer, I hear a lot of people talking about root cause, but when they talk about root cause, in my opinion, most of the time, they are really not getting at the true root cause of the problem. They're just dancing around, talking about the superficial manifestations of a much deeper kind of a problem. And this is why a lot of our CAPAs are Band-Aids. They are not fixes to the problem. That's why I think we need the PACA approach rather than the CAPA approach. But the root cause, as I would say, is basically following the rules without thinking. And again, I'm not trying to be patronizing here. I'm really not. But if you think that we're doing a good job with this, then how do we explain those statistics that I shared with you earlier? And one of my most important regulatory messages, and I talk about this a lot with my customers as well as in my podcasts and webinars, is don't just follow the rules, think. The late, great Douglas MacArthur said rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. Now, please don't miss my message here. I'm not saying don't follow the rules. I'm certainly not advocating anarchy. But what I'm saying is this. If the rules make sense, then we follow them. But if they don't make sense and we follow them anyway, and we agree that they don't make sense and yet we follow them anyway, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? And by the way, it's not just about the rules. Think about the statistics that I shared with you over the last nearly 2 decades. We've been repeating the same mistakes, following the same rules over and over, and somehow expecting a different result. So let's go through a series of more specific questions about CAPAs, and then once again, we're going to have a few minutes at the end for some Q&A and discussion. So please note down your questions or type them into the box there, and Evian can read them off at the end of the presentation. What's a CAPA and when should it be used? And equally important, when should it not be used? Well, maybe we should start with what the regulation, specifically the quality system regulation, says, and equally, if not important, what the regulation doesn't say. A lot of people like to focus on what the regulation says. And while that's certainly important, I like to focus even more on what the regulation doesn't say. Because in order to use regulation to your advantage, you need to understand not just what it says, but what it doesn't say as well. So here's a screenshot from the CFR. And again, this is not guidance. This is the CFR. This is regulation showing the extent of our CAPA regulation. This is it. That's all there is to it. And I'm going to pick through it in just a moment. So don't worry about having to read it on this particular screen. But there's not a lot of regulation. Again, I'm not talking about guidance or anything else, but regulation on CAPAs. Do we need more? Well, we'll leave that as a rhetorical question for now. So let's dig deeper. It's not enough to just simply, read and follow the regulation. We really have to understand it. Why? Because regulation, and this applies not just to CAPA, but all regulatory and quality regulation. Regulation is about 2 things. First of all, it's about the interpretation of words. And in that previous slide, I show you the words. And then second, and perhaps more importantly, your ability to defend your interpretation. Regulation is about 2 things: the interpretation of words and your ability to defend your interpretation. I can put the same set of words in front of you or me or 10 other people and get 10 or 12 drastically different interpretations of the same rules or the same words. And another thing that I find fascinating in our industry is, why do so many assume that FDA's interpretation of a particular set of words is the only interpretation or the best interpretation? I never make such an assumption. In other words, if FDA's interpretation of a certain set of words or regulations is consistent with mine, then fine, no problem, and we move on to the next point. But if FDA's interpretation is not consistent, is not substantially equivalent, to purposely use a regulatory pun, then I'm the first to go to the FDA, usually in a pre-sub or something else, and say, look, this is what the regulation says. This is why it's not applicable in my situation, or perhaps it's not possible in my situation. And here are all the reasons why. Okay, so it's incumbent on us to go to the FDA and make that argument. Otherwise, FDA is just going to assume that you're following the rules, whether they agree or not. Also, it's important to try to understand what I like to say, the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. And we'll see some examples. So let's dig into exactly what the QSR says when it comes to CAPAs. First of all, it says each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for implementing CAPAs. Okay, fine. But since that's clearly defined, why do so many companies continue to get pinged by the FDA for this? It's just, it boggles my mind. Once again, just refer to those statistics that I shared with you. So I'm not going to go through the details, but one of the things that the CFR recommends that we do is analyze. Okay, so what constitutes a proper analysis? You know, what you think is a proper analysis might not be what I think is a proper analysis. Remember, these are not binary questions. These are not questions like, did you do an analysis, yes or no? The more important question is, did we do a proper analysis? And how do we know that it was proper? In other words, how do we know the level of detail was sufficient? How do we know that there were not other possibilities that could have caused this problem that we're not aware of, and so on and so on? Investigate the cause. Obviously, I mean, to me, that's sort of a statement of the obvious, but what does investigate mean? Early in my career as an R&D engineer, I used to do what's called failure mode recreation. So a device doesn't work in the field, it's sent back to you, and it's my job to figure out how to try to recreate the circumstances to lead to that particular failure, whether it was a design issue, a manufacturing issue, a user issue, and so on. By far, in the vast majority of cases, I could not accurately reproduce the failure mode because I did not have enough information. The only time that you really get a lot of information is when something really, really bad happens, like the patient has a heart attack or a stroke or a death. At that point, pretty much everybody stops, and everybody is documented and so on. But if using a catheter example, if you're using a catheter and the hub of the catheter breaks off for whatever reason, most people they'll take out the catheter, they'll throw it in the trash, and they'll take out a new one. So they're not going to document in significant detail all of the circumstances that led to it, how was it used, and so on and so on. So what does investigate mean? How much investigation is enough? And another thing is, must we always investigate? As I said before, FDA assumes that complaints should all be investigated equally, and I disagree. CAPAs are exactly the same. Not all CAPAs are equally extensive, if you will. Some CAPAs might be relatively simple and relatively easy to fix, whereas other CAPAs might not be. So that is up to you to use your professional judgment to decide that. Identify the actions needed. Obviously, this is the most important process. And how do you fix the problem? But how do you do that? Well, one way to do it, as I mentioned, is with that failure mode recreation. But oftentimes we don't have enough information to truly recreate the failure mode. Therefore, we need to get a little more creative and figure out why it happened. Because if we don't know why it happened, i.e. the root cause, and I don't mean the superficial cause, but I mean the actual root cause, then how are we going to be able to identify actions needed to fix it? And if you're only putting Band-Aids on, which is unfortunately what a lot of companies do, not all, some of them are very good at this, I'll be clear, but a lot of companies, they're really good at putting Band-Aids on, and this is why they get the same or similar problems happening over and over and over again. Verification and validation. This is, basic quality 101, so to speak, to ensure that whatever action that we do come up with is effective. In other words, it works. You have to validate your solution. And at the same time, you have to make sure that it doesn't adversely affect any other aspect of your medical device in terms of safety, efficacy. You don't want to solve one problem or prevent one problem and at the same time cause another problem. And I see this happen a lot with physical devices. I see this happen even more with SAMD, with softwares as a medical device. They fix a particular part of code in the program, but what they don't realize is by altering that section of the program, it has effects on other parts of the program as well that creates problems. And in some cases, the problems that were created are bigger than the original problem that we tried to solve. Once we verify and validate that the solution is appropriate, now we have to implement and we have to report those changes. This is also very, very important. But at this point, are you done? Absolutely not. You're almost done. But the next step, and this is a relatively minor one. Well, no, actually, no, let me not say that. This is another important one. Ensure that the information that results from your CAPA is disseminated to the people that are directly responsible for doing the work. I mean, to me, this is a statement of the obvious, like most of the rest of these requirements. I mean, I don't think we need regulation to say this. This is all common sense, at least to me. But unfortunately, you know what they say about common sense. It's probably not as common as we would like to think. And finally, the last sub-requirement under this section is submitting the relevant information for management review. Okay, fine. I mean, to be honest, isn't that just a formality? Other than responsibility, because your senior management ultimately are responsible for what happens in the company, other than responsibility, does this really accomplish anything? Again, I'm being brutally honest here. Probably not. Because unless you're working in a really, really small company or startup where the senior management are hands-on folks, if you're working in a mid-size or a large medical device company, I can just about guarantee that your senior management are not going to know, certainly not in any detail, what what's going on or what the problem is or the solution, that kind of thing. And so this is sort of more of a legal thing. I'm not saying that's not important, because there is something to be said for responsibility, but it's really, well, you understand my point. And then finally, the last requirement from the QSR is that all of these activities that we just discussed shall be documented. Remember, the GMP added it. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen, right? But don't just document that you have the procedure, for example. Document the fact that you followed the procedure, and document the fact that document the results of the procedure. Once again, this and all of this seems very simple, probably obvious to many people, certainly me, and yet many people don't do it. Why not? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question. Do we need more regulation in the CAPA area? Well, I don't think so, because we already have the regulation. It's just that people are not following it for whatever reasons, or they're not following it adequately. Once again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but I think it's just very basic kind of engineering 101, kind of like design controls, engineering 101 to me. Many of you are familiar with the design control guidance that goes back to 1997, and it has not been updated since 1997. And a number of people, there have been discussions at FDA and outside FDA that maybe that 1997 design control document, guidance document, should be updated. For whatever it's worth, in my not so humble opinion, I say absolutely not. That is a very good guidance document, even though it is now nearly 20 years old. It's, to me, prudent engineering, or it's basic engineering. It's what we used to teach in engineering school. Believe me, I teach a graduate level course in a Ivy League engineering school, and I really question what we're teaching in engineering now, or maybe a better question is what we're not teaching. So I just went through with you what the regulation says. Now let's talk a little bit about what the regulation doesn't say. In other words, what are some things that might be missing? Well, short answer is I think there's a lot that are missing. One question is, when should you open a CAPA? And perhaps more importantly, when should you not? Now, again, this is this could be the topic of a part 2 or a more advanced webinar on CAPAs. But for right now, what I'll say is you should have criteria in your quality management system to define when a complaint or multi-complaints institute a CAPA. You should have well-defined criteria in your quality management system for when a change in risk, when new risks or increases in risk, for example, become known, when that would institute a CAPA. You should have defined in your post-market surveillance portion of your QMS, when new information from post-market surveillance, whether it's active or passive, and I've done several webinars and podcasts for Greenlight on post-market surveillance. We can provide those links to you if you want. When PMS information should go on to generate a CAPA, that is up to you to define. And by the way, it should not, underline not, be boilerplate. In other words, just last week, I was asked to review one of my customers' quality management system, and I gave them a lot of feedback. But the biggest piece of feedback I said is this quality management system is not specific to you. In fact, it could apply to virtually every medical device company on earth. If you have a quality management system that is sort of generic, that is copy and paste, if you will, as some of you know, you can go to the internet and you can buy, forms, that have a quality management system, and you can sign it, and now you have a quality management system. Absolutely not. This is an example of perhaps meeting the letter of the law, but you are absolutely not in any way, shape, or form meeting the spirit of the law. I'll give you one other example. I was invited to review a company's quality management system once, and I said, and I saw that, they had some examples of a particular device that I did not know that company made. And I said in my review, I said, do you make this device? And they say, no, Mike, we don't make that device. Why do you ask? Because it's right here in your own quality management system. I mean, if that's not the quintessential example of not only copy and paste, but the fact that they're not even reading what it is they're copying and pasting, I don't even know. I don't know how to explain that. And before the webinar started, Eddie and I were chatting a little bit about AI and using AI to do more and more, including submissions. I have a feeling that before you know it, maybe people are doing this already. People are using AI to generate their quality management system. I'm not sure if I'm keen on that idea or not. So my recommendation here is that you need to include these criteria in your quality management system. Then you need to test it to make sure. In other words, insert a problem purposely into your QMS and see what happens. See if a CAPA is generated. And if so, how it's investigated and so on. Because don't just assume that if your QMS, including your CAPA, ticks the required boxes, that it works. I never make that assumption. And I can't tell you how many times as an expert witness, I can take a company's quality management system, and I will acknowledge that this ticks all the FDA boxes, but clearly it didn't work because they're having all these problems over and over and over again. And the other thing that is not on this slide, my other recommendation is don't just do this once and forget about it, but periodically, whether it's once every 3 months, whether 6 months, once a year, whatever it is, periodically update these criteria. In other words, go back and ask yourself the question, are these criteria that we wrote 6 months ago or a year ago or 5 years ago, are they still adequate today? If they're still adequate today, then fine, no problem. And by the way, you should document the fact that on such and such a day, the following people met. We reviewed our complaint handling and risk handling and PMS and CAPA procedures, and there's no new information, so we assume them to be adequate, and we're not making any changes. And you sign it and you date it and you're done. If an inspector comes in and asks you the question, and I love to ask this question, okay, here are your CAPA, here's your CAPA SOP. That may have been written, I don't know, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. When was the last time that you updated it? If you tell me that it was updated last year, but you don't have any kind of documentation showing that it was updated, then once again, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. Again, I'm not looking for a 300-page PhD dissertation. I'm simply looking for a statement. It could be just literally a couple of sentences and a signature that says, on such and such a day, the following people met. We reviewed the information since the last review. There's no new or significant information. Therefore, no changes in our CAPA system are indicated at this time. And we're done. That's it. Once again, we're spending more time talking about, doing this than actually doing it. And yet this is another of the most common reasons why, as we said before, companies rather, get dinged by the FDA. what goes into a CAPA? In other words, what's the what's the anatomy of a CAPA? Well, first of all, my general recommendation as an outsider, in other words, put yourself in the position of somebody like me or an FDA auditor. What would you want to see? What would you need to see in order to understand why this problem happened, why your particular proposed solution is appropriate? I need to see that you've implemented that solution properly. And most importantly, I need to see what you've done to test that your solution not only fixed the problem, but also at the same time did not cause other problems. This is why I think failure mode recreation, because I think the regulatory logic, the engineering logic is exactly the same. So bottom line, it's up to you. The regulation doesn't tell you how to do these things. And in my opinion, anyway, the regulation shouldn't tell us how to do these things, because whether you're working on a Band-Aid or an artificial heart, obviously your CAPAs are going to be different. But here's a start. Here's a quick example, and I wish I could give you more details, but I have another example that's more specific. But obviously, I can't disclose for my customers or for my FDA experience. But here's sort of a generic table of contents from a real CAPA from a few years ago. You can just see the major sections: the summary, the initiation, the investigative plan, the investigative results, the action plan, the effectiveness, and so on and so on. So at the very least, you should probably have those sections. If you want to, rename the sections or whatever, I don't really care, to be honest. Shakespeare said, "A rose by any other name still smells as sweet." So what you call it, how you organize it, how you write it, quite frankly, I could care less. And I again, I'm being a little bit flippant on purpose, but I also am being 100% serious. What is most important is the content, and that you have done all of these things. And then here's another recommendation. You might want to bring in somebody, an independent person, whether it's me or somebody else, to review one of your CAPAs, or to review maybe several of your CAPAs, and kind of, give it shoot holes at it. One of the things, I'll use a slightly different example, but it applies here. So one of the things that astounds me with so many medical device companies, especially I would assume many of the companies represented in this audience, is when you have an FDA submission, 510K, PMA, de novo, whatever it is, who is the first person or people usually to see your submission outside your company? Usually it's the FDA. To me, that makes absolutely no sense. Why do you want to treat the FDA as your beta tester? Why not have somebody like me, again, I don't mean to be self-serving here, but somebody like me come in, put their FDA hat on temporarily, and if I can be a bit blunt here, bash the hell out of it. Literally bash the hell out of it. Because if you get somebody come in, whether it's reviewing a submission or whether it's doing a manufacturing audit, it makes absolutely no difference. If you get somebody come in and say, "Oh, you're all doing a wonderful job, wave the flag, have a parade," yeah, that might make you feel good. You might be accomplishing the letter of the law, but you are certainly not accomplishing the spirit of the law. You want, coming from a medical background, I want the clinical equivalent of a morbidity and a mortality conference, an M&M conference, where we get a bunch of surgeons in the room and they literally take off the gloves and they duke it out, right? That's what you want. When I do this kind of, and by the way, for those of you that are familiar with quality regulation, this concept should absolutely be not new to you. What am I describing? I'm describing the concept of an independent reviewer. Usually in the context of the quality, it's the independent reviewer is thought of and the engineering or the technical sense, which is an important role, but I'm just expanding that. We don't need more regulation. We need more people understanding the regulatory logic or the philosophical intent, that when you see a phrase like independent reviewer, that does not just apply to the engineering. It also applies to your regulatory submissions. It also applies to your processes, your QMS, like your CAPAs, and so on and so on. And by the way, when I do that kind of work for my customers, I want a ironclad consulting agreement that basically says, no matter what I say, I'm still going to get paid, right? Because I want to be able to be brutally honest with them, but that might not make some people entirely happy, right? The question is, if you're working in quality, for example, and you have somebody come in and they don't find any issues with your quality system, is that something that you should be proud of? Is that something that you should be happy about or not? Once again, I'll leave that as a rhetorical, something to think about. So here's a non-fictitious example of an actual CAPA. This resulted from a 483 observation from the FDA. It said that sampling plans are not based on valid statistical rationale. And they went on to say that there was no documented evidence. Remember, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. There is no documented evidence that substantiate the sample size calculation employed as part of this company's shelf life study protocol were based on any valid statistical rationale. And they further say that a population of samples tested for resulting devices density was representative of only 3 device units at each given time that was tested. There was no documented evidence to show that the sample size was based on any valid statistical rationale. I mean, to me, this is common sense. I mean, I don't mean to be, melodramatic here, but if there's somebody working in this industry that doesn't know this, quite frankly, they shouldn't be working in this industry. Once again, I consider myself to be a medical device professional, and I use that word professional. I do not take the responsibility lightly. I am expected to know what I'm supposed to do. I can't know everything. My wife has no problem reminding me of what I don't know. I certainly cannot know everything, but I am expected to know what I need to do. A surgeon is responsible for knowing what to do, not just how to do the surgery, but what happens if this happens, what happens if that happens, what are the alternatives to this surgery, and so on and so on. And if the surgeon, if he or she doesn't know that, or they make a mistake, or they omit something, then they're held responsible. I think medical device professionals, if we're going to call ourselves professionals, should be held to the same standard. Once again, to me anyway, this is basic. And so the question is, if we get a 483 like this, we can address it with a CAPA by looking into the statistics more. But that would just be fixing the symptom. That would be putting a Band-Aid on it. Maybe we need a CAPA on our entire CAPA process to ask the question, why did this happen to begin with? How is it that we got into manufacturing and we seem to not have a justification for our shelf life testing? Because I guarantee, and this is where my expert witness work becomes so valuable, what I can say to the judge and to the jury, well, if I can demonstrate that the company is making this seemingly simple, boneheaded, if you will, mistake, how many other mistakes might the company be making that maybe are not as simple or are not as trivial? And now that calls into question the validity of your entire quality management system. One of the things that I've learned in my expert witness work is that if the opposing counsel can impugn any aspect of my testimony, in other words, if they can show that any one thing that I said is wrong, then my entire testimony can be thrown away. It's kind of like the example I like to use. Sometimes I see press releases from some of the largest medical device companies on earth announcing their 510K was just approved. Their 510K was just approved. That is a factually incorrect statement. 510Ks are not approved. They are cleared. Now, some people would say, well, Mike, why you get so upset about such a seemingly simple mistake? Isn't it just semantics? Well, first of all, it's not semantics to the U.S. Supreme Court. Just look at the Regal v. Medtronic case that basically held a completely different level of liability for PMA devices versus 510K devices. But more importantly, for this example here, if this company, even if it's a very, very large established company, if this company is making this seemingly simple mistake in a press release, like saying their 510K was approved rather than cleared, then what other problems or what other mistakes could the company be making that might not be so trivial, that might be, in fact, more significant? And finally, why did it take FDA to find this problem? Why didn't the company find this problem first? I'm assuming that this company, like most companies, probably had their own internal compliance audits. Well, my question is, how thorough is your compliance audit if you miss a mistake like this and FDA finds that's a problem? How do you know if your CAPA system is working? And we're getting close to the end here, so please remember to type in some questions or write them down, because I want to be able to discuss some of these issues in the time that we have remaining. So how do we know if our CAPA system is working? Well, simply put, you don't know if it's working if you don't test it. So what I like to do is I like to purposely insert a problem into our system somewhere, maybe a fictitious complaint or series of complaints, maybe a fictitious change in risk, maybe a fictitious post-market surveillance information. One of my customers actually wrote a fictitious article that they put into their PMS system to try to test it. Obviously, you have to be a little careful how you do that, but I love that idea to test it. So you need to test it some way, and then you need to measure the outcome. This is classic verification and validation. You have to test it, and then you have to measure what you just tested. And so if your system responds the way that you think it should, in other words, that complaint generated a CAPA, and here's what happened, that PMS or risk information generated a CAPA, and here's what happened, then that's wonderful. Your system is working. But if you interject a complaint or risk or PMS information that doesn't lead to a CAPA that you think should, now you have to ask yourself the question, why did your system not work? So that's, a piece of advice. By the way, I have had a few of my customers push back on that. They tell me, Mike, we don't want to test the efficacy of our QMS or of our CAPA portion of our system. So I ask, why not? Because what if we show that it doesn't work? Now we have totally invalidated our quality management system, or at least a portion of it, because now we have direct evidence to show that it doesn't work. It's one thing to have a compliant system and assume that it works. It's quite another thing to test your system and have evidence to show that it doesn't work. And so in those cases, I say, quite frankly, to the customer, I say, look, either we need to talk about this and come up with a mutually amicable solution, or you need to find yourself a new regulatory or quality consultant. Because to me, that is, I'm not an attorney, but so I'm not sure if this is true in the legal sense of the word, but to me, that is gross negligence. To test your system, or sorry, not to test your system because you fear that you might invalidate it, to me, that is, if not gross negligence, it is definitely not the mark of a medical device professional. And as one of my friends, who is the VP of regulatory and quality for a very, very large medical device company, he and I were very, very good friends in graduate school. He likes to say, if you're working in regulatory or quality and people like you, you're not doing your job. I'll say it again. If you're working in regulatory or quality and people like you, you're not doing your job. Now, I understand why he says it. I would like to think that people would still like me at least a little bit. But again, my job is not to come in and just tell the company, oh, you're all doing a terrific job, pat yourself on the back. It would be very easy for me to do that. And I would probably have even more customers than I have today. Although, to be honest, I have, I'm very blessed that I have plenty of business to keep me busy. But we have to be willing to be honest. Should you assume that if your CAPA system is compliant, meaning that it meets the QSR requirements that we went through earlier, that your system works? Once again, I would never make such an assumption. Why? Because I can give you lots of examples where companies get 483s and warning letters, even though they have a CAPA compliant system, but they get 483s on their CAPA system. And I can give you lots of examples where companies have been sued and have ultimately either settled out of court or in some cases been found guilty, even though they had compliant CAPA systems, but it didn't work either. So just because it ticks the boxes, you should not, at least in my not so subtle opinion, assume that it works. How are CAPAs related to other parts of your QMS? You should have direct relationships, as I said before, between your complaints, your risks, your PMS, and probably other sections. In other words, I didn't put it in this presentation, but some of you have probably seen the picture of a QMS with all of the different boxes in lines going between all of them. Kind of looks like a spider web, right? That's the way your quality system should be. Each piece of your QMS should not live in isolation. Kind of like, as I used to say to my medical students, every single part of your body is in communication with other parts of your body, usually through the endocrine system or the neurological system or something else. There is no tissue or organ in your body that is completely independent of everything else. Your QMS is the same way. All of the portions of your QMS should be in communication with one another. This is, in QMS and in design controls, this is the concept of feedback, which, by the way, is not a regulatory invention. This goes back, this is Darwinian evolution. This is the concept of feedback in either neurology or endocrinology. We use lots of feedback in biology. That's the same idea here. So test your system and make sure not only that your CAPA portion of your QMS is working, but also test it to make sure that it's in communication, effective communication with the other parts of your system that's working. When should a complaint initiate a CAPA? There are a lot of parameters that go into this, but at a high level, what I would say, you specifically, your company should have specific criteria as to when a complaint or maybe a series of complaints goes on to initiate a CAPA. And those criteria should be unique for you. In other words, if I read your criteria for when a complaint becomes a CAPA, I should be able to know that this is specific for your particular device, your particular technology, your particular manufacturing methods. And if these criteria would be equally applicable to, say, a company making artificial hearts, and you do not make artificial hearts, then without even discussing the criteria, I know that it's not inadequate. That it is inadequate. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. It is inadequate. It needs to be company specific. It needs to be device specific. It needs to be technology specific. It needs to be manufacturing process specific. If it is not, then once again, in my opinion, although you might be meeting the letter of the law, you are certainly not meeting the spirit of the law. And, what good is having a quality management system if it's not written for you? What good, as I said before, is having a QMS that has examples in your QMS for devices that you don't even make? I wish I could tell you that I made that up. I'm not. And I wish I could tell you that somebody read what they were copying and pasting and at least asked the question, is this an example that we want to put in there? I'm not making it up. What do they say? Truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. Finally, why do we call a CAPA a CAPA? Why not a PACA? In my opinion, and again, I don't mean any offense here, but in my opinion, this is the total back-asswards approach. In other words, by calling it CAPA, we're putting the emphasis on corrective action. In other words, we're waiting for a problem to happen, whether it's a manufacturing issue, design issue, process issue, whatever it is. We're waiting for a problem to happen, and then we investigate it and we fix it. But don't you think that's not the best approach? Don't you think that we should instead put the emphasis on prevention and prevent the problem from happening to begin with? Admittedly, we can never prevent 100% of the problems. That's a given. But we can try. And the reality of it is, a big part of my business is when a company is already in trouble with the FDA because they're having a problem and they ask me to come in and help them get out of this big hole. Most of the time, perhaps not all the time, but most of the time, the problems that I see companies get into with the FDA, not only are they preventable, they're also predictable. Let me say that one more time. Most of the problems that I see that companies get into, not only are they preventable, but they're predictable. Because many people, they take the CAPA approach, which is required. They don't take the CAPA approach. If we're going to call ourselves medical device professionals, what exactly does that mean? And here is a great example of a PACA, not a CAPA. How many of you have watched the Netflix documentary, The Bleeding Edge, that they put out a few years ago? I strongly recommend to all medical device companies to have their employees, or at least the regulatory and quality and R&D and manufacturing, watch this video and ask yourself the question, could this problem or problems like it, could these problems happen to us? Could these problems happen to us? Even though likely you're not making any of the devices that are featured in this bleeding edge documentary. There's, you always have to look for similarities where no similarities appear to exist. So even if you're not making these devices, I guarantee that there are similarities in what these companies did compared to what you're doing. So ask yourself the question, could these problems or similar problems happen to us? And if the answer is yes, they might, even though they haven't happened to us or they haven't happened yet, or we don't know if they've happened, we don't have evidence of it, it might. Therefore, maybe have a CAPA and ask yourself the question, how can we prevent this problem from happening before it happens? And even if your conclusion is no, that these problems won't happen to us, then with all due respect, how do you know it? Prove it. I'm a big fan of the old Ronald Reagan mantra: trust but justify. Trust but justify. So you tell me that these problems can't happen to you. Okay, fine. Prove it to me that they can't happen to you. What analysis? What logic are you using to say that these problems can't happen? When you take something to the FDA, when FDA is doing their job, and let's be honest, FDA doesn't always do their job, but when they do their job, FDA's job is to criticize or be critical of everything. So I don't know what the weather is like where you live, but in Southern California and San Diego, it's almost always the sun is shining and it's a blue sky. If I walk into the FDA and say the sky is blue, FDA's job is to say, okay, prove it. If the sky is blue, okay, prove it. Notice that they're not saying to you that the sky is not blue, or they're saying that we don't agree with you that the sky is blue or whatever. They're not saying any of that. They're just simply saying, okay, you're making a claim, prove it. If you cannot substantiate that claim, if you cannot prove that claim, then in the regulatory world, this is what we call an unsubstantiated claim. Just like if you say something on your label, you have to be able to substantiate it. If you watch this video and you say to me, Mike, this can't happen to me, okay, fine, prove it. I think I'm going to skip that. And let's skip that because I want to allow some time for Q&A. The last couple of real quick bonus questions I want to share with you. Can CAPAs only be used for device-related or manufacturing-related problems? The answer is absolutely not. We can use them to fix any problem. So don't think of CAPA just in sort of the quality or the engineering sense. It can be used in lots of different senses. I had a company once institute a CAPA because they didn't think that the company was making enough money. Why not? I mean, that's obviously not a CAPA that needs to be, given to the FDA. That's, sort of a CAPA for business purposes. But the concept, the regulatory logic is exactly the same. How long or detailed should a CAPA be? This is another question that I get a lot. I don't know if I'm still allowed to use this metaphor, but my mother used to talk about one of her teachers in school when somebody would ask how long should the student's report be. The teacher would say, think of it like a woman's dress. Long enough to cover the important parts, but short enough to keep the interest. I know in this politically correct, hypersensitive society, I'm not sure if this is a politically correct metaphor or not, but please don't take offense. I'm trying to make an important point. Long enough to cover the important parts, but short enough to keep the interest. How do you know if your CAPA has been adequately resolved? Again, it's pretty simple. Test it. Ask yourself, could this problem or a similar problem happen again? And whether your answer is yes or no, the question is, prove it. How do you know that it will or will not happen again? And also ask yourself the question, not just this exact problem, but are there more basal problems that could happen or continue to happen that haven't happened yet? And finally, what are the product liability implications of writing a good CAPA, this could be a topic of a completely different webinar, but my recommendation for any of you who are old enough to remember the Bugs Bunny cartoon in the character Elmer Fudd, he said, be very, very quiet. In this particular case, be very, very careful about what you put in your CAPA, because while it might be beneficial from a regulatory or a quality perspective, it might be the kiss of death from a product liability perspective. So that's something that that you should consider as well. And if I ever do a more advanced version of this, maybe I can get into some examples. So just to tie this up, and we'll have the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Here's what we've talked about, albeit quickly, over the last little bit over an hour. Just a few quick final thoughts. Average regulatory professionals know the rules. The best ones know the exceptions. So how do you, and here's James Thurber that said, there is no exception to the rule, that every rule has an exception. And there are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but there are very few good ones, in my opinion. So how do you know how to become a good one, or how to find a good one if that's your goal? Simple. Learn when to follow, but more importantly, learn when to lead. If it's to my advantage to follow in somebody else's footsteps when it comes to CAPAs or anything else, then fine, I will be the first to do that. And when the auditor comes in, or when I go into the FDA, I will put in my PowerPoint in 72-point font, I am doing exactly what the people did before me. I'm doing exactly what the regulation asked me to do. End of discussion. Don't let you hit the door and the you-know-what on the way out. But if it's not to my advantage, if it's not possible to follow in somebody else's footsteps, then I will be the first to do something different, as long as I can justify it. Why? Because a person, I should change that obviously, but a person who wants to lead the orchestra must first turn their back on the crowd. And unfortunately, that is not a common approach in the regulatory or quality world, at least in my opinion. We have a lot of followers. We have a lot of people that are following in other people's footsteps. But here's another thing to keep in mind. If you're following in somebody else's footsteps, and many people do this, if you're following in somebody else's footsteps, there's one thing that I can guarantee, and that is you'll never go anywhere new. So at this point, that's the end of the formal presentation. I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I hope you found this information valuable, maybe a little different, maybe a different spin, a different view than the countless other webinars and podcasts out there about CAPAs. I like to put my sort of Mike Drew's twist on it. Hopefully you found that beneficial. For those of you that have to sign off now, once again, thank you for your attendance. And I want to thank my friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to do this webinar. Just want to offer, if there's anything that I can do to help, you have my contact information on the screen. It will also be in the handout. Feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help anytime. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Edian to manage the Q&A and also to wrap things up. Edian, it's all yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it. Really appreciate the presentation. We do have a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all, so I'll just let you guys know in the audience. We'll forward those on to Mike, and if he's able to answer them, that's great, but kind of the ball will be in his court at that point, but we will kind of forward those on.
I'm glad there's so many questions, Eddie, and by the way, that means that people were actually listening.
Oh man, there was a lot of discussion in the chat too, so it was a lively audience today.
Excellent.
So one of the main questions, at least the highest upvoted, was from L. Humphrey: how to handle an effective check for a process that has no planned recurrence. So design controls and new product registration. I suppose that might be if you're trying to do preventive action, I suppose. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe just get creative if you, what are your thoughts?
Eddie, I'm sorry, can you repeat that once more, please? A little bit.
Yeah, I shared it on the screen. I don't know if you can see how to handle.
Let me, hold on a second. Let me, just give me 1 second here. How do I get to, stop sharing. Okay. So now I can see. Okay, go ahead again, please.
How to handle an effectiveness check for a process that has no planned recurrence. For example, design controls and new product registration.
So as I understand it, a plan that has no recurrence, I guess that means that's something that you're only planning on doing once and never again. Is that correct?
That would be my assumption.
Okay. If
And I
and that's
hesitated
my
because I wasn't
assumption as
sure I
well.
could fully
But
understand that or explain this. Go ahead. Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
well, I'm going to make the same assumption, but if that person meant something otherwise, then they can either re-ask the question or just contact me after the webinar. But look, if you're only going to do something once and you're never going to do it again, first of all, it depends on the criticality of whatever it is that you're doing. You know, maybe it's something that you only do once, but if you do it wrong, it could significantly impact the safety and efficacy of the device. And if that's the case, whether you're doing it once or a million times, it doesn't matter because the potential harm is significant. On the other hand, if you're only doing something once, and even if you do it wrong, the potential harm is minimal or non-existent, then yeah, ideally, I would like to see some sort of a validation just to kind of see that it makes sense. Maybe it's just a quick and dirty sort of commonsensical check, and then move on. But again, I'm taking, you know, the regulatory logic here. To answer that question, I'm using is the risk-based approach, if you will. It's
Yeah,
kind of like to take that one step further in terms of risks and benefits. What if you have a risk that has a very high severity, but a very, very low frequency? That's exactly, as I understand it, what this person is describing here. How do you deal with a risk that has high severity, but low frequency?
Yeah. Okay. All right, let's go to another question. So this one is an interesting one. In some cases, the root cause for initiating a CAPA is identified as human error, but that is not always accepted by the notified body. What actions can be taken in such situations? Any thoughts on human error?
A lot of thoughts on human error, because basically what the first question comes to my mind is usability. So if the root cause of this problem is human error, i.e. usability, assuming that you did usability studies on your device prior to the market, why was it not detected then? Assuming that you continue to do usability studies on your device post-market, which is also, by the way, required by the FDA, although many people seem not to even know that, why did this problem happen then? And then if we assume that it's a usability problem, we have to understand the root cause. For example, is it that the users, whether they're surgeons or nurses or the patient or whoever it is it that they're using the device in a way that was not intended for it to be used? And I don't necessarily mean off-label. What I mean is maybe they're holding the device or manipulating the device in a way that the designer thought it was going to be held, but the user is holding it a different way. So there's a lot of different possibilities on the usability side. We have to identify if it's a usability problem, what kind of usability problem, and then we can come up with a potential solution. Maybe we need to update the labeling. Maybe we need to update the training. Maybe we need to put out a Dear Doctor letter. Hey, just want to let you know that apparently some of your colleagues have been having problems when they use the device this way. So we recommend that you only use the device that way. Last and certainly least, because no company wants to do this if they don't have to, maybe it might need some sort of a design change to fix the problem, but it's really hard to talk about the specific fix until we know what the specific problem is first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always one layer deeper you can go. Absolutely. Okay, another one. Let's do this one. Then I kind of have one that I think I'm just getting from a general sentiment. But this one, what is best practice for a CAPA that has an unidentified root cause following months of investigation?
Well, let's just, first of all CAPAs you should have in your QMS, all CAPAs should have a defined requirement to be closed within a certain period of time, whether it's 30 days or 90 days or whatever the number, that's up to you. However, I do not believe in absolute regulation. In other words, I think it's good to have a general rule that all CAPAs should be closed in 30 days or 90 days. However, if it legitimately takes longer because you're waiting for information to be reported or something like that, that's perfectly acceptable as long as you document it. So you create a note in your CAPA. Normally this CAPA would be closed by a such and such a day. However, we're still waiting on biocompatibility testing results or something like that. We anticipate that that information be available, say, in another X number of weeks, and then within X weeks after that, we expect to be able to identify the root cause and resolve the CAPA. So these CAPAs, this is another big problem that a lot of companies have. They have this CAPA sort of withering on the vine, and they don't go anywhere. What was the original question, Eddie? Because I don't think I addressed part of it.
Let's see. Good question. I went on to another one to get ready. What's the best practice when you have one that's been open for months at a time and it's just not been closed, not been resolved?
Yeah. Okay. So look, as long as when you say it's open months at a time, does that mean that somebody or bodies are pursuing, the investigation of the CAPA during those months? Or is it that it's just sitting on somebody's desk somewhere and nobody's even looked at it for the last 3 months? So if you can show that people are actively looking at it, even if it's like you say, like I said, you're waiting for biocomp data, and the biocomp data can take a long time to get. And so, once a week or once every 2 weeks, you revisit the CAPA and you just make a notation that this is still an active CAPA. However, we're waiting for our biocomp results, and that's expected to be available at such a time. I think that is what a reasonable medical device professional would and should do in those situations. So the short answer, Eddie, as long as some progress is going on during that time, even if you're documenting the fact that we have no progress, then I'm okay with that. If it's just literally sitting on somebody's desk, or if it falls behind somebody's desk, or if it's buried in 1,000 emails, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. And I can actually personally attest, as a manufacturing engineer who inherited an aging CAPA, the way they handled that was they put a 5 o'clock meeting on every different sites around the world on Friday. Friday at 5, we had a meeting to discuss it. It took several hours. Things got done a lot faster. And
that's
I don't think
clever.
anyone liked him, so he did that.
And by the way, and by the way, here's a small plug. Here's a small plug for Greenlight. As I understand it, Eddie, one of the capabilities of your Greenlight software is to make sure that problems like this don't happen.
Yeah, we do have forcing functions to make sure all of those different stage gates are met along the way. Absolutely. Jetty, don't use my name when you use that. Okay. Okay. I hate to be the one that well, anyway, so one last question, then we'll kind of let this, we'll kind of let everybody get back to the, back to your day. Benjamin asked one up front. He says, one question: how do you notify body auditors? And I think we'd extend this to FDA inspection or investigators. Respond if you actually do it the other way around, switch it from CAPA to PACA.
That's an interesting question. And by the way, I like that NOBU sort of acronym. I haven't seen that before. But look, I'm going to be honest with you. Most auditors, this is not a criticism, just simply an observation, but most auditors are not very creative or outside the box thinkers. They basically kind of expect what to see, and if you don't give them what they expect to see, then you're probably going to have problems. I would like to think that if you tell them that we're taking this approach, even though it's maybe not the conventional approach, and you can justify all of the reasons why you're taking that approach, then they will respect you for that. And not give you a 483 because you're not taking their approach. But here's the bottom line. Whether you call it a CAPA or a PACA, Shakespeare said, any other name still smells as sweet. It's the information that goes into it that's the most important. So as long as you have all of the important, complete information in there, what we call it is, in my opinion, not very important. This is exactly the same regulatory logic that we've talked about before, Eddie, when it comes to 510K versus letter to file. Whether a lot of companies get in trouble with FDA under change management because they do a letter to file and FDA says, no, you should have done a special 510K. But here's the way I look at it. Whether you do a letter to file or a special 510K, and I've done webinars and podcasts from Greenlight on this many times over the years. Whether you do a 510K or a letter to file, the information in those two documents should be exactly the same. So on the CAPA side or the PACA side, as long as you have the information, how about this is a pragmatic solution? How about internally, for the purposes of trying to put more emphasis on prevention? Internally, you approach it as a CAPA, as a PACA, but in your official documentation that you might show to somebody outside, like the FDA or somebody else, you just take the conventional route and call it a CAPA. Maybe that's a reasonable compromise.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. We won't get into that. There are other questions about how to implement this through risk management, PFMEA, et cetera. What frameworks have you seen? I don't know if you want to, I know we're kind of whistle bit here. So maybe maybe that's a topic for a future discussion, I suppose, unless you want to touch on it real quick. I know we're kind of
Sure.
over. All right. Thank you so much.
I think we've covered an awful lot. So
yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Eddie. I was just going to say, once again, thank you to our audience. Thank you, especially to those of you that have asked questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get all of them, but please do feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help. And one last time, thank you to Eddie and to my many other friends at Greenlight for the opportunity to have a platform for discussions like these. I think they're very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the informative presentation and being willing to answer some of these questions. As a reminder to those of you listening, we will be sending out today's recording and presentation slides. Look out for that email and send us some feedback on behalf of Greenlight Guru. Actually, I am going to launch a survey real quick. I'd love to get any feedback right now because I'm always looking for feedback so that we can open our own PACAs, I suppose, and prevent things in the future. But on behalf of Greenlight Guru, thank you all. We'll let you guys get back to the rest of your day. Take care. And Mike, if you hit the bottom right where it says leave stage, that will take you back to the backstage.
Bottom right. I'm sorry, I don't think I'm seeing it on the bottom right.
Kind of a.
Oh, that's not what I wanted.
It says leave stage. Yeah.
Oh, there.
Those of you.
There. Sorry.
No.
Usability.